To question number 7. Is sulfur dichloride polar or nonpolar? So first, let's write the structure. We have 2 lone pairs on the sulfur, and then on the chlorine, we have 6 lone pairs in total. Well, 3 lone pairs, 6 electrons in total. And we can recall that chlorine is much more electronegative than the sulfur. So we can show non-zero dipole moments being formed from each sulfur-chlorine bond, and the molecule as a whole has a non-zero dipole moment. So let me write down here that this molecule is polar. So this is because the shape of the molecule is bent. So we can see that it's bent because the central sulfur atom has these 2 lone pairs, causing it not to be symmetrical, so the chlorines don't cancel each other out. So it is bent from the lone pairs on sulfur. And also, chlorine is more electronegative. This causes a non-zero dipole moment Okay, so I'll just also take note that the actual sulfur-chlorine bond is polar as well. Since chlorine is more electronegative than sulfur. Okay, so let's see what the junior tutor said. Is sulfur dichloride is a bond between an atom of sulfur and 2 atoms of chlorine. To determine if it is polar or nonpolar, we have to solve for the difference in their electronegativity. A difference greater than 0.4 means that the bond is polar. Sulfur has an electronegativity of 2.85, while chlorine has an electronegativity of 3.16. So when they solved for the difference in electronegativity, they found that they got 0.58, which is much greater than 0.4. Therefore, the bond is polar. It can be determined by reviewing its Lewis structure. A bond is said to be polar if there is a sharing of electrons. From its Lewis structure below, there is a sharing of electrons between chlorine and sulfur. Therefore, the bond is polar. So this sentence isn't necessarily correct because you can have a sharing of electrons and the bond can also be nonpolar. So an example is like carbon and hydrogen. So they still share electrons, but the carbon-hydrogen bond is nonpolar. So I can just kind of correct them. sulfur dichloride is indeed a polar molecule. However, the explanation is not necessarily correct. Okay, so I said it is indeed a polar molecule. However, explanation given was not necessarily correct. The reason why the molecule is polar is because its shape is bent due to the lone pairs on sulfur, and that chlorine is more electronegative, causing a non-zero dipole moment in the molecule. The sulfur-chlorine bond itself is polar since chlorine is more electronegative than sulfur. And then I'll also say that a bond can be nonpolar Okay, and then I just also added that a bond can be nonpolar when electrons are shared as well. For example, the carbon-hydrogen bond, it is nonpolar since the electronegativity difference of carbon and hydrogen is only 0.4.